It is becoming like electricity or the internet. AI has moved from being an application to now where it's general purpose.
This is a systematic way of thinking through a great deal of complexity.
Netflix was a huge first mover in terms of understanding how people are behaving.
We can inform our intuition about what should matter more and where we should move next.
Complementary investments around technology can be about 10 times the investment in the technology itself.
This is a lot to bite off and to chew.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 11th episode of our EPH Talk. My name is Christian Moldenhauer, Managing Director of Expert Powerhouse, Europe's fastest growing consulting network. We are dedicated to helping teams worldwide by providing on-demand consultants, proudly serving over 200 leading companies in the consulting and industry sectors with top freelance talent. Today, we have a great topic to discuss, namely unlocking competitive edge, creating first mover advantages with AI for businesses. So we're going to talk about how can we create a first mover advantage with AI for businesses. Before we dive into our discussion today, let's take a moment to reconnect because I see that a lot of people joining us today. Of course, I'm happy to share also some thoughts before introducing our distinguished panelists today. So I just read the latest Forbes article, which says 25% of companies have already adopted AI in the United States. So for sure, a lot of companies are experimenting with AI at the moment, and there's going to be a profound influence on the way we think, interact, and plan for the future. And of course, with that, there are immense possibilities and challenges for businesses going forward. We have with us today Professor Vasant Dhar. He is professor at the Center for Data Sciences at New York University, NYU. Vasant is a renowned expert in the field of artificial intelligence, data science, and predictive analytics. As the director of the PhD program in data science, he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to our discussion. And Vasant is also the founder of SCT Capital Management, which has been using machine learning system investing since the mid-90s. Welcome, Vasant.
Thank you, Christian. Happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
Very welcome. And let me also introduce Eric Best. Eric is the founder and president of Best Partners SC, and he has an impressive background as the global scenario strategist at Morgan Stanley for over a decade. He's not only a journalist, an author, speaker, but also an accomplished solo ocean sailor. So with someone who's loving water sports, really welcome. And I'm thrilled to have you here today, Eric. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be here with you.
Thanks for joining us. And I'd say without further ado, let's jump into our conversation on how to create first mover advantages with AI for businesses. I'd say let's have a bit of a discussion on AI first and then turning on to scenario modeling, starting with Vasant. We've seen a lot of revolutions, electricity, internet, now AI, and we're seeing so much talk about it. What is different this time with AI?
In one sense, everything is different. And in another sense, nothing is different. But I think for what we care about, there's a lot of things that are different. From within the field, progress always seems incremental, and that's how it's been going. But every once in a while, it crosses an inflection point, and it gets people's attention. And I think AI has recently crossed two of those inflection points. We've seen sort of successive paradigm shifts in AI. When I got in, it was the expert systems phase. You had to specify knowledge, put it into the computer, and the computer would follow the rules. That was the approach to intelligence. That kind of fell short because it's very hard to specify intelligence top down, right? It's just too subtle, it's too complicated. And not surprisingly, that approach stalled in the late 80s, 90s. And then that's when machine learning started coming to the rescue and data and databases were beginning to happen, but you still had to do feature engineering about problem formulation and all that kind of stuff. I think there are a couple of things that move the technology forward significantly, namely the ability to ingest data directly from the environment, right? Whether it was images, text, numbers, no curation, just ingested directly from the environment. And that was a big deal because it got rid of this sort of what I call the feature engineering bottleneck. And then recently we've had a machine that's now capable of talking to you. And that's been a holy grail, one of the holy grails of AI, just to have a machine that you can talk to. And that's always been the bottleneck, is the interface. We've had to shoehorn our interaction so that the machine can understand us on its terms. But now the machine has brought it to us and can now understand us on our terms. So in a sense, it doesn't matter that ChatGPT doesn't know math, it hallucinates. All of that stuff is to be expected. This is like a very initial stage of AI, but we can see where it's going, right? The fact that it can actually talk to us has gotten the world's imagination in the last 6 months. And that's been a real game changer. There's this feeling now that something is really different, that we really need to jump on this. It's too much to ignore what's going on now in AI.
And that's a great introduction, Vasant. As you say, like we can talk to AI, it can talk to us. Maybe there are some applications already where people get their avatars, and there's been recruiting interviews on LinkedIn where people are actually talking to an avatar and the answers are generated by ChatGPT. There are a lot of use cases and a lot of companies experimented. What do you see as key benefits for companies being a first mover in that field?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the one thing I probably neglected to mention in my sort of summary about what's different this time is I mentioned ChatGPT, but I think sort of driving force is the emergence of these pre-trained models. And you talked about electricity, and that's where the analogy comes into the picture, is that AI has moved from being an application, which you configured each time anew for every use case, to now where it's general purpose. It is becoming like electricity or the internet, where you have these pre-trained models, you take them, you configure them, and you apply them. So stuff that would take a year can now probably be done in a day, right? That's the kind of order of magnitude increase in productivity that we're talking about. And I've done this myself in a couple of cases where I've taken pre-trained models, in this case from Hugging Face, and built applications in a couple of weeks in the areas of vision and language that would have taken me years to do, prior to that, right? So it's really decreased the barriers to entry significantly. So earlier on, you had barriers to entry. You had to build your own each time, right? Everyone was building their own. Now, suddenly you have this world where you have like a plethora of pre-configured, pre-trained modules, and you can just take them and configure them. And so that's what's really driven an order of magnitude increase in productivity. And that's just too hard to ignore.
And what would be the first mover or strategic advantage? Even an individual person probably could have a model, train it, bring it into the market. Would it be different from corporates doing that? How do you create first mover advantage as a corporation with AI? Or is it actually a good thing to do that and you maybe just expose yourself to a lot of risks when you...
But I guess my point is that the risks have come down significantly while the benefits have gone up. So that's what's come down, right? So the risk part of it is actually really come down. The real question now is, are there barriers to entry for other people, since it's a democratized kind of thing? And the answer is no, there are no barriers to entry, right? Everyone can enter this, which actually makes it all the more important that you don't wait, because one of the things about these technologies is that if you wait too long, you're too late to the game, right? So it's important to be early to the game, because the risks have been really whittled down to very little and the benefits are just significant. So that's the way I see it, is the first mover advantage is in not being the last mover. You're left behind. And as we go forward, I think we'll talk about other first mover advantages as well. But to me, that's the important thing, is that you cannot afford to ignore it anymore. And I'll hand it over to Eric, because I think that it's important to understand that it's not obvious what you should do, right? Just because you can't ignore it doesn't mean it's obvious what you should do, right? So even though the tools are becoming commoditized, the thought process, the intellectual process of what should we do is extremely important, right? So it's important not just to move, but it's also important to do the right thing. And that's even the more important thing.
And Vasant, before we move over also to Eric, are there certain elements? I know some people talking about companies sitting on a big data lake, on big consumer data, on big history of data that, of course, you can use to train models. Is that something that is a competitive advantage still in these days, or you will also see this becoming commoditized as the models itself become more spread and used?
That's a great question. And the way I look at it is that there is always advantage in data. There's always advantage in having data that no one else has. And we will get to that as well, right? Because that's also a source of the first mover advantage, is just the ability to gather better training data faster than the competitors. And these tools have made it possible to collect training data more easily. So data is absolutely the key. We've seen this occur already with the internet giants, right? They established huge advantages through data, and that's going to continue to be the case.
Can you give an example maybe of that, just to make it a bit more concrete also for the audience?
There are so many. Netflix was a huge first mover in terms of understanding how people are behaving, their watching patterns. Right? The CEO of Netflix famously said that their competitor is not Disney, it's sleep, right? That they're competing with people's sleep, not with Disney, right? But I could go on. There's so many cases of first mover advantages to data among big tech.
Great. Thanks for that start. And Eric, maybe let's turn also over to you, because the question becomes, of course, for a lot of executives and companies, it's obvious we need to move fast and we need to do something with AI, but there are maybe millions of use cases that you can do. And Eric, you've got, of course, a lot of experience in strategic scenario planning. You've been decades with Morgan Stanley using those techniques. Maybe you can give us a quick intro on scenario planning, and also how that has changed and might also change going forward with AI.
Okay, thanks. This is a lot to bite off and to chew. First, let me say that the scenario thinking approach that I learned back in the early 90s and applied to the internet evolved out of Royal Dutch Shell's practices and then became somewhat codified at Global Business Network, where I then went to Morgan Stanley to apply it to this question of their strategic question at that time. And I think it's a historical parallel in the sense that the internet jumped up in front of everybody in the early 90s, and everybody was faced with the same set of questions. What is this exactly? Nobody could really tell you what it was exactly. What effects is it going to have? Oh, lots, but we don't know how or when. And back then in, say, 93, I know it's a long time ago, I did a survey of companies with respect to their sense of the internet as a strategic imperative that they had to act on. And about a third of the companies out of 35, a third said, internet is like the telephone, only different, no big deal. Another third said, we know it's really big, but we haven't really assigned anybody to it, and it's making us uncomfortable because we know we should do something, but we're not doing it because there's all this other stuff we're trying to do. And then one third said, hey, this is gigantic, transformative. We have to get in front. There are huge first mover advantages and disadvantages. So it's a bit of a minefield how many ways this thing could go wrong. And I mention this because in conversations Vasant and I have had about AI, there's a real parallel here. And when he just said, there are no barriers to entry, and that makes it more important that you don't wait, wrote down, to do what? Because I think the organizational dilemma at the moment is something like, wow, this is huge. We know we should do something. Who exactly should do it, given that we're all busy doing the stuff we were doing before this came along? So what kinds of decisions, staff reorganizations, commitment to talent? You have questions in the question field about, should we do this? Should we do that? Yes. What should you do? And so the scenario approach, which is deliberate, structured conversation among the most important people in the enterprise whose thinking makes a big difference and who are running the place. If you read about who actually runs the company, you say there's roughly 20 or 25 people. Those people need to get together to have this conversation about AI because there's so many possible elements, you say use cases or applications or ways it could matter more or less to the enterprise, to their competition, to their customers, to their client base. And this is a systematic way of thinking through a great deal of complexity on the premise that we cannot predict what the outcome will be, but we can inform our intuition about what should matter more, and therefore where we should move next. What is the right next thing to do? And that's what the objective of the exercise is.
And Eric, so of course, there might be some people saying, okay, you do scenario planning to basically find the black swan and you want to exclude your worst case scenario and maybe you're able to mitigate it. So you're saying it's more facing the risks and making sure you don't miss out on anything? Or you think it's more on the other side where you say, look, let's imagine the new world and find interesting use cases and to capture new markets and applications? What's your view? Where does scenario planning most help in these scenarios?
Okay, so my first thought about that is there's this human desire to eliminate risk. We like certainty. We want to know what's going to happen. And scenarios really, I think, were invented to acknowledge that we don't know what's going to happen, but there are some ways of thinking about it that could be fruitful if we were very systematic in the context of the enterprise, of the actual people who are trying to do something. What are they trying to do? They're trying to build these things and sell them to those people. Should they be applying AI right now and revamping their whole approach? Should they listen to the people who say it used to take 50 or 100 people to do it? Now it can be done with 3 people. If that's true, what exactly should they do next? The approach is intended to get very specific about who's the enterprise, what are the strategic imperatives, what are you trying to accomplish? And in that context, what is a strategic question you think really matters with respect? Should we or shouldn't we buy something, acquire something, hire somebody? What should we do? The idea is to, yes, have that conversation among the people who matter most and simultaneously help them develop a shared framework of understanding the kinds of uncertainties that matter most and the implications of those, and therefore what you might consider doing. Because at the end of the day, somebody has to decide to actually do something. And so one of the points I wanted to make sure I underscored that I really feel I learned in the context of Morgan Stanley globally, but then subsequently with other clients, is that senior ownership of the idea that this is very important. We need to jump on this. We need to get our best people into this. We need to come out of this with a common understanding and a common commitment to the things we've decided to do. That's the purpose of doing the exercise. That's what it's designed to do. And it ends up being customized to who is the enterprise, who are the people, what are the actual issues here about whatever it may be.
And Eric, can you be specific on an example maybe to tell us a bit more how such a scenario planning would look like in the real business? How do you bring those 20 people together? What is the question that you start with? Do they all need to prepare and come? Or they come together and then have a kind of brainstorming? How could we think about that scenario planning and then building also that consensus that you need to really have all those answers that you talked about?
Eric, can I jump in ahead to just get a thought in here? Because I've been a client of Eric's in a sense. So when I was at Morgan Stanley, Eric was actually conducting some of these scenario planning exercises, right? And so let's say he was doing it for technology, we would get into a room and we would get into a bunch of groups and Eric would ask us to, like he said, what are the key uncertainties facing? What are the most important uncertainties facing you? And we'd get together as small sort of subgroups of people and talk about that. And eventually we would come to some sort of a common understanding through a discussion as to at least try and surface what the most important uncertainties are. So as a client of Eric's, that's the way I saw it, but I'm sure Eric has a richer view of it. But that was me doing things in a room where he was orchestrating the scenario.
As you said, so you were in the room, you're talking about the things that worried you most, maybe. Of course, I think today it's even a more complex world. There are more things out there, and it's impossible for one person, of course, to know everything that's going on and also what's available in terms of use cases and technology. So do you also, when you do that kind of process, maybe need some external input or a lot of external input to see what are actually the risks or additional benefits you could create? But sorry, that's just the thought that crossed my mind when you were saying that.
No, you asked for an example. So I just gave an example of me as a client in the room, right? And the kinds of things we would consider are things like, are interest rates going to go up or down? Because the interest rate environment was important for banks. So that was a critical kind of uncertainty, right? So some people would say, oh, rates are important. Other people would say, oh, the evolution of tech is important. Could Microsoft run everyone's IT in the future, stuff like that, right? So that's the kind of brainstorming and assumption surfacing that would go on during some of these scenarios. Sorry, Eric, back to you.
No, Christian, if you think it's helpful, I'll just say that from a kind of step-by-step approach, you start with somebody deciding we should really do this. When you ask an example, my first really big example was Morgan Stanley deciding we need to figure this internet thing out. And somebody very senior said, okay, we're going to commit this group of people, in that case, believe it or not, to 5 days on the technology side to go through these steps of what's the question we're trying to answer, what's everything that could matter, what are the most important uncertainties within that. If they were to play out in different ways, think of a matrix, give you 4 scenarios. Turns out to be, that's really the best number, because 3 doesn't do it and 5 is too many. If we think through, create and think through, imagine, push our assumptions of what's possible into the extreme corners of how, and if we make up together stories out of this logic that are plausible, that would push us, would challenge our own official future about the way things are going to go. If we do that, will we then come back into the present, having gone through this exercise, with a different sense of what's true or what should we do? And what I will tell you is, if you get the right senior people involved, and you give it the time that's required to push those boundaries of thought and then draw a set of inferences from them about what does it now look or feel like something we really should do, that happens. So one example in the Morgan Stanley case was, gee, we need to take this guy here, that guy right there, who, by the way, he's the best project manager in the place. People respect him. They listen to him. And if you want something done right, you give it to that guy. We say to that guy, okay, you're going to have to figure out what does it mean to get into the internet now? Those are the things they were asking in 1995. Gee, what should we do to be web aware everywhere? So I think a similar thing would occur here. Who exactly in this room is going to take on the responsibility of being the first among equals and figuring out what we're doing, which we just collectively agreed we have to do something. It probably needs to look like that. Who's going to do it? And you had other questions in your list of possible things to explore. And then what about the organization? Yes, you have to get senior commitment. You have to get real brain power in the room. And my job is really to help that brain power be as productive as possible in this context, to set forth a bunch of ideas about, okay, here's some strategic options we could take. And then somebody with the seniority and the responsibility says, I'll take that one. So I've seen it happen, that it moved people. It readjusted budgets. In my favorite case study of Morgan Stanley Japan contemplating an acquisition of Yamaichi Securities, in the scenario exercise, suddenly somebody said, wait a second, there is no positive upside scenario for Japan in the next 5 years. We just can't see it. Now, that wasn't a prediction as much as it was a kind of an opinion, but it went through the room just like that. And then somebody who was very senior said, why would we buy anything? And that stopped them from buying Yamaichi, which it turned out later Merrill bought it and lost about $1.2 billion on it. And so that was taken as, okay, here's a great example of scenario thinking at a senior level on a key strategic question that actually moved the people responsible to go from we should do this to we shouldn't do this. And by the way, there are a bunch of other things now we realize we should do. So that to me is the objective, is to get into that group of people and help them come to real conviction about why things are different, why we have to do things differently, who's going to actually do it, what is it actually going to be. And by the way, hit the repeat button, because change is happening so fast that all of this is moving and you're going to have to just keep adapting.
And that was a thought that just came to my mind, Eric. So when you describe it, of course, you have the senior leaders together. It's in that sense, of course, sometimes also a bit of a very hierarchical organization, depending on the organization. So once they decide on something, they have to pull through. Now, with AI, Vasant said it, no barriers to entry. You can play, everyone can play, you can try different things. How do you go about this iterative and agile development and bring it together with the ownership and the senior leadership that to push forward those initiatives in large organizations? Does it reconcile? Do you have to build a pirate tower when you make it happen? How do you think about that?
I'm not an organizational theorist, but as you were just saying what you were saying, I found myself thinking, I'm pretty sure that's what management and leadership are supposed to be about, which is to decide on the important thing and then a course of action and then get people to do it, whether you're autocratic or democratic. That's a cultural question. But there's no pat answer. I don't know if I've said this to you before, but I usually say scenarios have to be bought rather than sold. The idea of doing it needs to be something a senior person understands. I know what I'm getting into here, and I want to do this because this is actually the only way to engage people in the face of a lot of uncertainty so that we come out the other side with a set of answers that we think are appropriate for us.
Yeah, so people buy into it and you actually get it implemented. Vasant, if you think back at the times being a client, but also now, of course, on your projects, are there examples in that space that come to mind?
I think we've seen interest in AI by itself is not new, right? It's been on the burner for some time. But like I was saying, the uncertainties around the technology have gone down, but the uncertainties around what you should do, that's an entirely separate issue, right? For example, 10 years ago, we had insurance companies very interested in using AI to improve all kinds of things, underwriting decisions, risk management, prospecting, all that kind of stuff. But there was a lot of uncertainty around its capability. And you had different insurance companies adopt very different strategies. Some said, let 1,000 flowers bloom, develop some applications, and if they're successful, other people will follow. And a great example was this company called Nationwide, right? They had this very catchy jingle, right? Nationwide is on your side. And in their case, they built the system for renewals. So when time came for renewal, the AI would, out of 65 possible messages to give the client, it would rank them, and salespeople found that if they followed them, their renewal rates actually went up significantly relative to what they were doing. So it caught on like wildfire. Very successful, specific application, like on renewals. And they said, oh, let's demonstrate success in something, and then we can start building out from there. You had other companies that took very different approaches. They said, we have no idea what sort of applications will be successful, but let's start building some infrastructure. That was a much higher risk kind of an approach, like much more of a commitment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. And I suspect it thinking, and it didn't work when they went on a, if we build it, they will come an attitude, right? So there is no one successful strategy. But what's changed in the last 10 years from that time is that the technology has matured, right? And like I said, you've got these pre-trained models. So the barriers to entry have gone down, but the uncertainty on the business side has not. So that remains the challenge, right? It's a question of figuring out what to do. As Eric said, yeah, we've got to do something, but what? That's anything but obvious.
Can I just say this for a moment? Some people have read the book, The Wisdom of the Crowd, or the idea that we're all smarter than any of us. And one of the things I've learned in the process of doing this work is that the most important idea could come from anybody at any time. The question is, was anybody listening? Did they actually do anything? So if you think of this in terms of it being, no, this is a thinking exercise within the enterprise, and we're going to mobilize our best brains and get them to work in parallel. It wouldn't be a coincidence that, no, the correct answer to the question is 24. Why is that the correct answer? Because 24 you can divide by 4 and you get 6. And that means you could have 6 people sitting together talking about something. That turns out to be a very good size of a group for humans trying to do this work together. Mm-hmm. So you're saying, I'm going to mobilize the 24 best minds I've got. To your point earlier about research, I'm going to give them some of the ideas that you probably need to have in your mind right now about AI, facts, concepts, what ifs, uncertainties, etc. Because we, the 24 gathered here, do not necessarily have the answer. But what we do have is a reason to come together. We're in this enterprise together in order to figure out what should we do next with respect to this explosion of uncertainty that can restructure everything around us? We have to start, and we have to start by talking about what is this really? What do we think it means to us? And how do we think it could develop? And because we can't think of everything, as you pointed out, and we can't just ask GPT-3 to tell us the answer.
I was going to say, can't you just ask 6 times ChatGPT and then use it as a first base, as a discussion with the executives?
So look, it becomes a personal, professional challenge to me. Hey, Eric, how would you use AI to enhance the development of scenarios themselves if you wanted to think we're going to do better scenarios than we would have done if we hadn't had this? Look at all the things it can do. I don't, at this moment, have the answer to that, but I do believe that in a project generated around AI, the use of AI in the project itself makes a lot of sense, both based on what you think you know and what you are pretty confident you don't know and you need to discover. So it's about getting started. I'll go back to what Vasant said before. No barriers to entry make it more important. You don't wait. Or what? Yes, that's the question. To do what?
And from the experience, maybe both of you have seen a lot of organizations. What are the typical things that you start with? Let's say you have the scenarios defined. Do you go and see, do we have the organizational capacities? Do we have the right people? Do we need to acquire or make ourselves more familiar with different language or models out there that can help us? So what's the starting point? Because I think there's a big ecosystem around it. There are a lot of suppliers. There are a lot of models. Where do you start, basically?
Vasant, can I jump on this for a second?
Yeah,
I'll just give you an example because I think it's illustrative in a structural kind of way. There was Morgan Stanley in 1995. They had a very avant-garde head of institutional technology, a guy named Kevin Parker, who read Wired magazine, read about scenarios, sent a team out. They found me, brought me back, and he decided we need to use scenarios to think about the internet and what it means to financial services. That generated a conversation inside of Morgan Stanley among the top technology people and some of the key business leaders. And that conversation produced a set of scenarios, the first round, one of which was a scenario called T+0, which was meant to imply, imagine a world in which globalization doesn't stop from here, because remember, we're in Thatcher, Reagan, privatization of the world, globalization's unstoppable, and where the technology that we think we understand is going to outstrip our expectations. It's going to do things nobody really thought of doing, and more people are going to have access to it than we thought and apply it in ways we hadn't considered. So T+0 became this just a scenario, not a prediction, but a very rapidly evolving, very challenging to incumbents, very challenging environment that caused people within Morgan Stanley to say, wait a minute, what are we actually thinking about the credit card business? What are we thinking about the difference in Europe to this? What are we thinking? Wait a minute, what about the regulation? What about transparency? Blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, because they started the conversation, they got into this and it led them to things like, and to your point about how does the organization learn? We ended up making these big posters describing the scenarios, putting them in the elevators in the technology building. So everybody going up and down every day would be looking at, oh, what is that? T+0, blah, blah, blah. And one day a guy came in my office. He said, I saw the implications of T+0 that, you're going to have this crazy broadband world. That's ridiculous. That'll never happen. You guys are stupid. I said, there's an opinion. And it turned out within about 3 months, something happened in broadband software, and suddenly broadband capacity exploded because of some change in software. And the implication of that, Morgan Stanley was already working on that. And that to me is a good example of you find things that you realize you now believe could happen and you start working on it. And that's your first mover advantage because you actually imagined that outcome and made an adjustment in that direction.
Thanks for sharing. And I think it's a great example. Of course, there will be also not everyone be in favor of it. And there will be maybe objections also along the way, what you typically see in a change program. Are there examples, or what's been the toughest things you've seen where you had to convince people actually to go into that scenario planning? Or would you say if there's too many objections, well, guys, figure it out on your own? Yeah, maybe it's those 30%, let's say, look, it will not be a big thing and we'll see us back in 10 years.
Okay, so I have a really good example of that. I have to be careful not to identify the client, but the example I want to think of is, okay, this was a client in the digital currency space, and the most senior person in the room actually didn't want to think about the scenario in which the SEC would make an adverse decision with respect to cryptocurrency being a security or not. So the scenario implications in this particular case stalled because people in the room realized, oh, that's unthinkable to this CEO. He really doesn't want to consider that outcome because it's too potentially damaging to his business model. And I mention this just because you're talking about what do people agree or disagree about. Yes, often scenario discussions will surface what people have either explicitly disagreed about or implicitly agreed about it, but it turns out, no, they don't agree after all. You can turn that up, but the purpose of the conversation is to get to the so what that people do agree about. We should move on this. We shouldn't move on that. We know why now we're doing that. And therefore, things become more coherent.
And by the way, it's also the case that people sometimes march ahead without doing any scenario thinking, or they assume that there's a certain quadrant that's going to play out. Eric and I were talking about a case study that I did for a mid-sized business where they're in the lending business and they wanted to know whether AI was ready so that you could have drones flying around houses and inside them and assessing the condition of the house, as opposed to expensive humans going there and costing tens of thousands of dollars, charging in fees and all that kind of stuff, right? So like huge transaction costs. And their sort of question for the future was, will all these processes change? Will we just send a drone and give it the coordinates and it'll fly around? We'll get permission from the people in the house. It'll fly around inside the house and come back and take pictures, right? And to them, they were envisioning the world moving in that quadrant. And so they wanted to basically work with me and do the research on, are these things feasible? Is the technology there yet? So not everyone does scenario thinking. Some people just say, I think this is the way the world is going to go and we're going to commit to it. It's a riskier way to go.
So how do you prepare for that uncertainty? What do you see companies doing? Do they set up like a technology radar? Maybe the equivalent would be like an AI radar, seeing how far is the technology to eventually decide, look, we're going to build that drone use case you've mentioned, or we're just going to wait and see how the technology evolves or what our competitors doing and not going first, or we actually going all the way in and doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is all of the above. I don't know. This was a sort of a small to mid-sized business. The top management team was 5 to 10 people, easy to make decisions. But I can imagine that in a larger enterprise, this would be a real discussion, right? And you might actually devote some resources into setting up a little lab to investigate how far the technology is, to explore that kind of scenario. So it just depends, which is why I was saying like all of the above.
I found myself thinking, if I go back in my own history to when I surveyed these 35 clients of GBN to find out how important you think the internet really is, and I got that a third, who did we call? We called the person who wanted to be identified as the chief strategy officer or somebody in the C-suite to answer the question, how are you guys thinking about this? And some of them were really grateful to be asked, and some were resentful to be asked because it was just too disturbing a question. But as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, hey, get on the phone and call up the chief strategy guy for the top 20, whatever you want, and just say, look, I just like to know, how are you thinking about this? Are you moving on this or not? And see what you get. And I would stake my life on the idea that you're going to get a range of answers from, we're in it with both feet, we've made this an initiative, to I wish you hadn't called me because this is my nightmare that we're not doing anything. It's people, it's individual people in enterprises who have a job to think about the hard things. And we're just saying, here's a hard thing to think about. And here's an approach that could get you started and get you to some really meaningful answer for yourselves as to what to do next.
And I fully agree. And in a sense, it's also being honest about the challenges that you face and not deeming something unthinkable, like in that example, Eric, you've mentioned. Maybe to the audience also, please, if you have any questions, of course, feel free to raise them in the chat, because we're going to approach time-wise also the Q&A session. So if there are any things that you would like to ask Eric, and of course, feel free to put it in the comment section where you can enter it. I had some questions coming in before session started already. Some people asked us, and probably one is around the typical objections. So the question was like, of course, you've been involved in a lot of scenario planning exercises. What are the typical objections and how did you overcome them?
But by the way, while Eric is thinking about the answer, as I run this podcast called Brave New World, my last guest was the CEO of DBS Bank in Singapore. It's one of the largest banks in Asia, Piyush Gupta. And I asked him this question: do you do scenario planning? And what do you see as the most important dimensions? I'm not going to share his answer because I think the conversation is worth listening to, and I couldn't do justice to his answer in a few lines. But it was a fascinating conversation. And Piyush happens to be a protege of John Reed, worked for Citibank in the 90s, right? He was a tech guy and now the CEO of a bank. So he's come up with a tech mindset. And it was really interesting listening to him talk about how he thinks about uncertainty and scenario analysis.
That's a good mentioning. So we can also encourage everyone to have a look at Vasant's podcast, Brave New World.
I mentioned that explicitly because I did ask him about scenarios. So that's why it came to mind. So it's not just a brazen plug for my podcast. It's actually quite relevant to this conversation.
Well, I think we should be comfortable with brazen plugs myself. But I'll just say that scenario is a kind of a term of art. Some people in the insurance business think they're doing scenarios if they say, what if interest rates were, here and here? Oh, look, there are 3 scenarios. No, not to me. Those are single point forecasts. And the scenario process, I have no idea what anybody else's experience has been with however they've used the tool. But my approach is one that's deeply conversational among the key players in the enterprise and usually involves some advanced work to get at their individual thinking before we try to mobilize their collective thinking in the room all at the same time. So it's very dependent upon the process itself. To say what I do is I conduct music that's being written by the players who are playing it while they write it, which is the emergent scenario process of discovering what it is you think could happen and what do you think you should do if it does happen. And oh, by the way, what are you actually going to do? So that's my briefest, most compressed description.
Thanks for sharing. There's been another question come through from David. I think it's very concrete. What are the must-have AI apps that businesses should use to get a first-mover advantage? And maybe you frame it a little broader. So what are maybe the AI tools or language models that businesses should have a look into to decide if they want to have a first mover advantage?
I think the one thing I should point out is that advantage doesn't come from tools or technology. Advantage comes from an integration of technology and a design, or sometimes a redesign of business processes, right? And sometimes these complementary investments. One of the things, Christian, that you had asked me in our sort of preparation for this session was, what does the academic research say about success with these kinds of investments? And if there's one thing that stands out, it's that the complementary investments around technology can be about 10 times the investment in the technology itself, right? The design, the redesign of workflows, people costs, et cetera, can really dwarf what the cost of technology is. So it's not just a question of which apps will give me competitive advantage. It's really a question of like, how do they integrate with my goals? And you can have a great app, but it's not going to move the needle. Or you can have a not such a great app, but if you just get it right, it could be significant. So it's really a combination of the technology and business thinking and business processes that leads to advantage, not just the technology.
Thanks, Vasant. And I think that's a really great conclusion, maybe also towards the end, about the entire ecosystem and how you bring it into the business.
I mean, it's like Eric was saying, who's going to do it? How's it going to get done? That's all part of the redesign of processes. So it's a very human intensive exercise.
I fully agree. And I think, unfortunately, Eric dropped out, but I would like to, of course, thank you very much for being here today. And also Eric, because I think it's been super insightful and it was a very engaging discussion. I learned a great deal about the challenges, opportunities, and of course, we'll post that link to the video also later here on LinkedIn. Really appreciate that you could made it today, Vasant, and Eric, of course, also. I would like for everyone who joined today, thanks very lot for being here with us. And of course, please stay in touch for upcoming LinkedIn Lives event that we frequently host. And there will be many interesting speakers lined up. So please stay tuned and don't miss out on that. I'd like to thank you for joining us today a lot. Take care. See you soon. And Vasant and Eric, thanks a lot for being here today.
Thanks. My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. And feel free to reach out with any follow-ups. Be glad to engage.